The Miller family moved into their 19th-century Vermont farmhouse with the hope of a quiet life. The centerpiece of their renovation was a massive, silver-gilt mirror purchased from the estate of a reclusive collector. The frame was a masterpiece of mahogany and tarnished silver, featuring carvings of laurel leaves that looked oddly like reaching fingers. When it was bolted into the studs of the main foyer, it added a regal touch to the home. However, within 48 hours, the glance-back phenomenon began. It started with Lily, the youngest daughter. She complained that when she ran past the mirror, her reflection didn't just follow her, it watched her. She claimed that when she was halfway down the hall, the mirror Lily would stop in the center of the glass and stare at her back, waiting for her to turn around. By the end of the first week, the house felt physically different. A thick, static-like tension hung in the air of the foyer. David, the father, began to notice that the reflections in the silver-gilt glass were slightly off. The colors were more muted, and the shadows were deeper than they should be. One night, while checking the door locks, David caught his own reflection. But it wasn't a mirror image. The reflection was standing 3 inches closer to the glass than he was. His double had a look of predatory hunger on its face, its eyes wide and unblinking. David froze. He raised his right hand. The reflection raised its left, but with a slight, agonizing delay, as if it were a puppet being pulled by reluctant strings. The psychological impact took a toll on their collective sanity. The family began to suffer from mirror gaze paranoia, the irrational but piercing fear that every reflective surface was a window for something else. David's wife, Elena, began to hear a scratching sound emanating from behind the drywall where the mirror was mounted. It wasn't the sound of mice, it was the sound of fingernails on glass. Every morning they would find the mirror covered in oily, gray handprints. The terrifying part was that the smudges were on the inside of the glass. No matter how much Windex they used, the prints remained, trapped in the silver backing. One evening, during a violent thunderstorm, the power flickered out. David approached the mirror with a flashlight. As the beam hit the glass, the reflection didn't show the dark foyer. It showed a vision of the house in an absolute ruin. The walls were scorched, and the furniture was rotted. In the center of the glass stood a tall, gaunt figure, a man in gray, with skin like wet parchment and fingers that were far too long. The figure pressed its face against the glass from the other side, its mouth opening to reveal a void of teeth. The glass began to vibrate, a low, guttural hum that made David's ears bleed. Terrified, the family didn't just remove the mirror, they sought to entomb it. They hired a local contractor who refused to touch it until it was covered in a heavy shroud. They eventually crated the mirror in a wooden box lined with salt and buried it 6 feet deep in a remote corner of their acreage. But the haunting didn't end. To this day, the Millers cannot look into a bathroom mirror or even a darkened window without seeing a flicker of that gray man standing behind them. They learned the hard way that a mirror doesn't just reflect the world, it can harbor an ancient, intelligent malice that views our reality as a banquet. In the winter of 1994, the Harrison family inherited an antique Harlequin doll. It was a mechanical marvel from the late 1800s, featuring a pincer-like porcelain jar and glass eyes that seemed to track movement. When the brass key in its back was turned, it played a sharp, dissonant melody while its head tilted and its hand mimicked the act of writing. It was placed on a high shelf in the bedroom of their 6-year-old son, Toby. Within days, the innocent atmosphere of the nursery evaporated. Toby stopped playing with his toy trucks and blocks. Instead, he would sit on the floor, staring up at the Harlequin for hours, his lips moving in a silent conversation. When his mother, Sarah, asked what he was doing, Toby's response chilled her to the bone. "The Smiler is hungry, Mommy. He says the other toys are taking up his air." Sarah dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination until she walked into the room the following afternoon. Toby's favorite teddy bears had been systematically executed. Their heads were pulled off, and their stuffing had been used to create a circle around the Harlequin, which had somehow moved from the high shelf to the center of the floor. Toby was sitting inside the circle, his eyes red from crying, whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." The doll's music box began to trigger itself in the dead of night. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the distorted, tinny tune would drift through the vents of the house. Sarah and her husband, Mark, would find the doll in different parts of the house every morning. Once, it was sitting at the kitchen table with a steak knife in its porcelain hand. Another time, it was perched on the headboard of their bed, staring down at them while they slept. The mechanism inside the doll sounded like it was grinding bone instead of metal. The aggression turned physical during a dinner party. A guest made a joke about the creepy doll, and moments later, a heavy crystal vase on the sideboard shattered spontaneously, sending shards of glass into the guest's arm. When they looked at the Harlequin sitting in the corner, its porcelain jaw was hanging open, and a dark, viscous liquid resembling old blood was seeping from its mouth. The family attempted to throw the doll into a nearby lake, but the next morning Sarah found it sitting on the front porch, dripping wet, its painted smile appearing to have stretched so wide that the porcelain had cracked across its cheeks. The Harrisons eventually realized that the object was a vessel for a thought form of pure malevolence. They didn't dare try to destroy it again by simple means. They contacted a specialist who performed a containment ritual, sealing the doll in a glass case etched with protective symbols. However, the psychological scars remained. Toby, now an adult, suffers from a rare form of pediophobia so severe that he cannot enter a store that sells mannequins. He still swears that on quiet nights he can hear the faint rhythmic ticking of a clockwork fart beating beneath his floorboards. The Black Wardrobe was a monolithic entity of oak and iron that stood in the master bedroom of a rented flat in London's Highgate district. It was ancient, its wood so dark it appeared charred, and its doors were carved with scenes of a silent harvest, figures in robes reaping fields of what looked like human hair. Mark and Elena, a young couple looking for a fresh start, ignored the landlord's warning never to lock the wardrobe doors. They thought it was a charming, if slightly morbid, antique. They were wrong. The wardrobe was a gravity well for human misery. It didn't just exist in the room, it consumed the room. Within weeks, the couple's vibrant relationship began to desiccate. They stopped laughing, they stopped talking. The air around the wardrobe was perpetually stagnant, smelling of old sweat and funeral incense. Elena began to suffer from the compression, a feeling that the walls of the room were leaning in toward the wardrobe, and the wardrobe itself was growing larger every night. The malevolence manifested through auditory infiltration. Mark began to hear voices coming from inside the oak doors, not voices he recognized, but a low, multitonal humming that resonated in his teeth. He found himself drawn to the wardrobe, standing before it for hours, his forehead pressed against the cold wood. He began to believe that the wardrobe was a lighthouse for the lost, and that he was being called to join the things inside. One night, the wardrobe finally opened itself. Elena awoke to find the room bathed in a sickly gray light. The doors of the wardrobe were wide open, and the interior was not a closet. It was a vast, echoing cavern of black wood that seemed to stretch back for miles. Inside, she saw the harvested, pale, translucent figures hanging from the internal racks like forgotten coats. Mark was standing at the threshold, his hand reaching into the void. "It's so quiet in here, Elena. No more noise, no more pain." Elena managed to pull Mark away, but the wardrobe didn't give up its prey easily. For the next 3 nights, the wardrobe hunted them. It would move 3 inches closer to their bed every time they blinked. The carvings on the doors began to weep a thick black resin that burned the floorboards. The humming became a scream that only they could hear, a sound that shattered the windows and cracked the mirrors in the apartment. They fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The landlord later found the apartment empty except for the wardrobe, which was now located in the exact center of the room. When he opened the doors, he found Mark and Elena's wedding photos pinned to the back wall with iron nails, the faces of the couple carefully cut out. The wardrobe remains in that flat, a silent, heavy sentinel that feeds on the dreams of those who sleep in its shadow. It is an object with a singular, malevolent intent, to turn the living into nothing more than a memory stored in the dark. Julian Vance was a man who lived exclusively through a lens. An American professional photographer with a celebrated but dark aesthetic. He had built a career capturing the hidden rot of the world. Based in the humid, shadow-drenched streets of New Orleans, Louisiana, Julian spent his free time scouring the most obscure antique markets of the Deep South and Europe for equipment with a history. In the winter of 2024, during a rain-drenched excursion through a derelict flea market on the outskirts of Berlin, Germany, he found it, a 1950s rangefinder camera. Its body was wrapped in tattered black leather that felt unnervingly soft, almost like cured human skin. The camera was impossibly heavy, its weight suggesting a core of lead rather than gears. Its lens was a deep, bottomless black, a void that seemed to absorb all light that touched it without reflecting a single glint. The merchant, an old man whose face was a jagged map of scars and chemical burns, practically shoved the device into Julian's hands. His fingers trembled as they touched Julian's. "It doesn't take pictures," the man whispered in a voice like grinding gravel. "It takes debts. Every click is a signature on a contract you didn't read." Julian, blinded by his obsession with rare finds, handed over a stack of euros and left, oblivious to the man's terrified sigh of relief. Back in his New Orleans studio, Julian began using the camera for a series on urban decay, focusing on the crumbling cemeteries of the Garden District. He noticed the first anomaly during development in his darkroom. Every roll of 36 exposure film yielded a 37th image, a physical impossibility for the camera's mechanical advance. The 37th frame was always a shot of a location Julian hadn't visited. A pitch-black basement he didn't recognize, a rusted cemetery gate at midnight, or a distorted, wide-angle view of his own front door from the perspective of someone or something waiting outside. Even more unsettling were the manifestations. In the background of his candid street photography, a figure began to appear. It was a tall, blurred entity with no face, draped in a tattered funeral shroud that seemed to move even in a still photo. With every roll of film Julian shot, the figure moved closer to the foreground. In the first roll, it was a speck in the distance. By the 10th roll, it was standing at the edge of the frame. Julian's pulse quickened with every development. He was no longer just a photographer. He was a witness to a slow-motion stalking. The camera's malevolence was not merely observational, it was causative. Julian took a portrait of his mentor, a legendary American photographer named Harlan Reed. In the developed photo, Harlan's face was obscured by a swirling, sickening swarm of black, moth-like shadows that seemed to be vibrating off the paper. 2 days later, Harlan was found dead in his New York penthouse. The coroner was baffled. Harlan's throat and lungs were completely filled with a rare, extinct species of black moth, as if they had manifested inside his very cells. Julian realized with a jolt of pure, visceral terror that the camera was a predatory documentarian. It didn't just record the future, it selected a tragedy, brought it into focus, and forced it into reality. The psychological erosion was swift and total. Julian became a prisoner of the viewfinder, believing that the world outside the lens was a lie. He felt that if he ever stopped looking through the glass, the faceless figure would finally reach him in the real world. He began to see the static of the world, the invisible layer of rot and decay that exists just beneath the surface of the mundane. He photographed a beautiful park in St. Charles, and the photo showed a mass grave of plague victims. He photographed a newborn baby in a cafe, and the photo showed a withered, ancient corpse in a cradle. The camera was stripping away his ability to experience joy, forcing him to witness the inevitable end of all things. Julian's sleep vanished, replaced by the mechanical sound of a shutter clicking in the corner of his room. He heard the camera breathing, a wet, rhythmic sound that emanated from the leather-wrapped body. He tried to lock it in a lead-lined safe, but the next morning he would find the camera sitting on his nightstand, the lens pointed directly at his face. The self-portrait was the final straw. Julian awoke one humid morning, finding the camera sitting on his chest, its weight crushing the air from his lungs. He took the film to his darkroom with hands that shook so violently he nearly broke the canisters. The 37th frame was a photo of Julian himself,
but his skin was rendered transparent by the black lens, revealing a rusted clockwork mechanism inside his chest that was winding down to its final tick. The faceless figure was no longer blurred. It stood directly behind him in the photo, its long, spindly hand resting firmly on Julian's shoulder. In a fit of panicked rage, Julian attempted to destroy the camera. He took a heavy sledgehammer to it in his driveway, but the tool simply bounced off the leather casing as if it were hitting a pressurized rubber tire, the vibration nearly shattering Julian's arms. He drove to the edge of the Mississippi River and hurled the camera into the muddy, churning depths. He watched it sink, praying the silt would bury it forever. But when he returned home, he found the camera sitting in the center of his desk, perfectly dry and radiating a faint, unnatural warmth. The camera had bounded with him on a molecular level. It was a symbiotic nightmare he could not escape. Eventually, Julian went blind. His optic nerves didn't just fail, they simply withered away into blackened husks, as if the camera had drained every ounce of sight from his body to fuel its own dark internal visions. He now sits in total darkness in his New Orleans home, the air thick with the smell of old film chemicals and stagnant water. He can no longer see the world, but he still hears the rhythmic, metallic click of the shutter echoing in the silence of his room. He knows the camera is still there, perched on his desk, tirelessly taking pictures of his slow, agonizing decline, waiting for the final frame to be exposed so it can claim the debt in full.